Good morning. Welcome to the fourth virtual hearing for the review of the Heritage Act 1977. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present. Today's hearing is being conducted virtually. This enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. Today we will be hearing from a range of stakeholders, including local council representatives and community groups. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the virtual hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it is important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. Today's proceedings are being streamed live and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, a few notes on virtual hearing etiquette to minimise disruptions and assist our Hansard reporters. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify who questions are directed to? And could I ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking? Could everyone please mute their microphones when they are not speaking? Please remember to turn your microphones back on when you are getting ready to speak. If you start speaking whilst muted, please start your question or answer again so it can be recorded in the transcript. Members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so we can all be heard clearly. Also, to assist Hansard, may I remind members and witnesses to speak directly into the microphone and avoid making comments when your head is turned away. I now welcome our first witnesses, Councillor Linda Scott, Mr. Ben Peachy, Miss Lisa Newell, and I think we might also have Mr. Terry Trodria. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation? And could I invite Councillor Scott, if you could start.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Linda Scott, President of the body Local Government New South Wales and a councillor on the City of Sydney Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peachy, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Ben Peachy, Executive Manager, Strategic Planning and Urban Design at the City of Sydney Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do we have Mr. Trodria on the line with us? Miss Newell, do we have you on the line?
Yes, can you hear me?
Right, Miss. Yes, we can. Thank you, Miss Newell. Could I ask you to please state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
My name's Lisa May Newell. I'm a Principal Strategic Planner with Hornsby Shire Council, and I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do we have Mr. Trodria? Has he joined us? Okay, well, at this stage, would you'd like to take this opportunity to commence by making a short statement? Councillor Scott, would you like to start?
Thank you, Chair. I would, and I start by acknowledging that I am in Sydney today, so acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose land I'm on. I thank also the committee for the opportunity to represent the local government sector at today's hearings, and I'm appearing in my capacity as the President of Local Government New South Wales. Effective heritage management is, of course, at the heart of the work that local governments do across New South Wales. Collectively, local governments are the custodian of over 40,000 items listed on local environment plans across the state, and is the largest collective owner of much of our beloved heritage assets here in New South Wales. We acknowledge that this inquiry primarily focuses on the legislation affecting the management of state-listed heritage items. With that said, however, of course, local government has a close role in the assessment of development applications, protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage, and importantly, also as a development proponent. Disappointingly, the discussion paper released by Heritage New South Wales does not list the protection of heritage as a guidance policy theme. Any heritage legislation must be the protection of heritage, and this most fundamental goal should be front and centre in any reforms recommended following this review. Heritage reflects and shapes the values and aspirations of a community and celebrates our rich history. Local government knows this acutely, and it so often falls to already overstretched councils to bear the increasing cost and responsibility for maintaining our state's heritage where the state government fails or refuses to do so. It's critical that the effects of these costs and operational burdens on councils are also addressed as part of the reform. To manage the over 40,000 locally listed items across the state, councils receive between $5,000 and $20,000 per council per year by the state government to subsidise operating budgets in managing these significant inventories. This funding is, of course, a drop in the ocean compared to the quickly escalating costs to councils that are required to protect this local heritage. It's critically important that the heritage sector at both the local and state government level is appropriately funded and resourced to deal with the increased volume and complexity of heritage assessments across the state. At our 2019 local government conference, councils resolved to advocate for minimum standards of maintenance and repair for locally listed heritage items within the Heritage Act. This is a critical reform that's desperately needed to prevent the widespread loss of heritage as a result of demolition, particularly demolition by neglect. However, as part of the ongoing planning reforms, the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment has taken steps to prohibit councils and remove the option of charging compliance levies. And the consequence is that this will limit the capacity of local governments to undertake this compliance work, including the protection of heritage. We call on Minister Stokes and the state government to commit to adequately resourcing councils for this compliance work to protect heritage. Fundamentally, local governments are deeply concerned about how often existing heritage protections are also turned off, where a development is deemed to be, for example, state significant. Time and time again, as the New South Wales planning system exponentially increases the number of applications assessed as state significant development, the capacity for councils and communities to protect our heritage is dramatically diminished. Councils continue to express significant concern about any potential reforms that may limit local government's capacity to provide comment or concurrence to development applications for state heritage items, or any moves towards sanctioning further ministerial discretion in determining heritage controls. Additionally, local government strongly wants to see progress on the long-awaited reforms to Aboriginal cultural heritage management. This must be progressed urgently to bring greater certainty, better engagement and shared decision-making with Aboriginal peoples about the protection and celebration of our cultural heritage. Again, at the local government conference in 2017, councils resolved to advocate for greater tax-based incentives to support local governments to promote ownership of the cultural assets that we protect. This suggested reform would make an enormous impact in the protection of our local heritage. I welcome the focus of this committee, recognising the fundamental importance of both built and cultural heritage to local communities, and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Mr. Peachy, would you like to also make a brief statement to the committee?
Yes, thank you. So the City of Sydney welcomes the opportunity to speak to the committee today about the review of this very important piece of legislation. The city has many layers of history and culture embedded in its places, which tell the story of the city and its people and contributes to its livability, environment and the economy. The City of Sydney has over 400 items on the State Heritage Register with places of local, state, national and world heritage significance. We also have about 2,200 local heritage items, plus many of the city's distinctive suburbs and high streets recognised in local conservation areas. The city strongly supports the Act, its objectives and the role of the Heritage Council. The objectives should be generally maintained, with that for adaptive reuse strengthened such that it facilitates this critical aspect of conservation. We see an ongoing need for specific heritage expertise on the council, and in particular we recommend the reinstatement of the New South Wales Government architect to the council, and that changes to acknowledge Aboriginal cultural heritage in the Act must be driven and managed by Aboriginal people. So the city recommends avoiding the categorisation of heritage listings due to the perceived devaluing of significance. Rather, we see there could be different pathways for the management of significance, but these should be directly related to the significance of a place and its contributory elements. Streamlined approaches should also be investigated, but efficiencies can be found in current structures. We often see an overlap or a disconnection between planning and heritage exemptions, and the ability for applicants to seek heritage approval prior to planning consent can create inefficiencies and complexities. The city supports incentives for conservation, and the city is available to work with government should it pursue schemes similar to the City of Sydney's Heritage Floor Space scheme elsewhere in the state. The city's scheme helps fund the conservation of heritage buildings through a market mechanism that requires developers to purchase floor space from heritage item owners. It is specific to Central Sydney and can only be managed through local environmental plans, as it involves local planning settings. So there need to be a degree of adaptation should it be used in other places in the state. Integration of heritage and planning is critical to effective conservation and adaptive reuse. The Heritage Act must not be switched off for state significant development. It is even more relevant as certain developments and precincts of state heritage significance are lifted up into this development assessment pathway. There is a need to retain interim heritage orders as an exceptional course of action. The city has used these orders very rarely, but the recent example of the former Kwong War Cha Chong and Company building in Chinatown unearthed a highly intact Chinese Australian shop that is a time capsule to past Chinese migrant communities and would otherwise struggle to have been conserved. The city embeds heritage in its strategic planning, including in its local strategic planning statement, precinct studies, and development capacity forecasting. We have shown that heritage does not have to be set aside to achieve employment and housing targets. The City of Sydney's heritage areas, managed under local controls rather than the Heritage Act, are some of the densest, most job-rich and highly valued places in Sydney. The City also encourages the preparation of robust evidence to understand land value impacts and unintended consequences before offering financial compensation for listings or support for poorly maintained buildings. Any financial support should be to facilitate adaptive reuse and leverage the unique values of a heritage place. Acknowledging the breadth of heritage throughout New South Wales, it is our experience that sympathetic adaptive reuse is not compromised by heritage listing. Finally, we'd also recommend that the review look to include mechanisms to stop demolition by neglect of local heritage items and enable councils to have those powers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Peachy. Ms. Newell, would you like to also make a short statement, please?
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for my connection difficulties earlier. I think probably Local Government New South Wales and City of Sydney have summed up much of the position that Hornsby has taken in a much more local and localised and suburban way. Our primary concern with the review as it was the scope of the review and our feeling that it would be better that both the EP&A Act and the Heritage Act were reviewed as mirror companions at the same time with regards environmental heritage. The expression squeezing a balloon comes to mind. If you squeeze one, the other one bulges or splits, and it's very, very important. And I think the local government submissions have actually borne this out in parallel, even though that they were separately written, is that any reform to the Heritage Act and reform needs companion reform in the EP&A Act and for local government to practice it. Our submission was primarily that of operational question and detail. If the reforms put forward and the issues put forward are together, then how would they operate at a local government level? How would that work with local planning, both strategic planning and development control planning? What changes would need to happen, right down to the issue of what's exempt and complying development. So our major point was that those two acts need to be reviewed in concert to proceed with a holistic way to go ahead with looking at and enjoying New South Wales heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Newell. Mr. Trodria, have you been able to join us, and can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your patience. Could I invite you in the first instance to please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Yes, my name is Terry Arthur Trodria. I'm a strategic town planner with Lane Cove Council. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Trodria. And would you also like to make a short statement to the committee?
Thank you. Lane Cove Council welcomes the opportunity to make comment on the proposed review of the Heritage Act. Our council supports in principle best practice measures for recognising, conserving, reusing and celebrating the important heritage of New South Wales. Many of the suggested measures in the discussion paper are reasonable and timely, in particular those measures which may assist in adaptive reuse of the State Heritage Register items. However, while supporting the principle of activating heritage places for tourism, legislation needs to recognise that some uses, while excellent for attracting tourists, may be incompatible with the amenity of surrounding uses. For example, cafes, bars, hotels and shops may have an adverse impact on nearby residences. Changes of use to attract tourism must always be consistent with such matters of consideration as those listed under the conservation incentives in the standard instrument for the local environment plan, clause 5.10.10, which does not suggest that changes should not have any adverse effect on the amenity of the surrounding area. Lane Cove Council also supports the principle of providing a graduated response to non-compliance, such as a system of fines leading up to court action as a last resort. However, care should be taken not to weaken the power of government to use enforcement powers appropriate to severe non-compliance. So Lane Cove Council in general supports the proposed expanded owner incentives, philanthropic funding and public ownership proposals of this review, insofar as they encourage development of otherwise neglected sites often undergoing demolition by neglect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And could I also ask you, Mr. Trodria, if you're asked to respond to a question, for the benefit of Hansard, due to the technical issues you're experiencing, could you just identify yourself for the benefit of Hansard before you answer the question?
Certainly, thank you.
Thank you. And on that basis, I'll invite members of the opposition if they would like to start with questions, and I'll go firstly to the Honourable Walt Secord.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and for the benefit of Hansard, Walt Secord. Ms. Scott, you mentioned in your opening statement that you were surprised that, quote, protection of heritage was actually not in the review. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, as I said, it's disappointing to see that it's not there, and rather surprising. So I think really it's, I guess, a question for the relevant minister and government. But on behalf of councils, we would strongly advocate that this be a primary goal of the review, and of course a primary goal of the Act. Councils, of course, make these views very clear, but it's also a strong view that we hear from our communities. I know in the City of Sydney, for example, we have a large number of resident groups, Glebe Society, Millers Point Resident Action Group, you know, and I'm sure these groups are replicated across a wide variety of councils who are strongly engaged in ensuring that the preservation of heritage in their local area is something that is seen as important by the council and the state government, and also that this kind of activity is resourced. I think you've heard from all the speakers today from the differing local governments across the state about the importance of funding that preservation of heritage, and about the importance of ensuring that we're not seeing demolition by neglect. So I do hope that the committee is able to come to a view about that and make a recommendation about the importance of the preservation of heritage being a primary function.
Good. I was actually going to rephrase the question, because when we actually finish our deliberations, you know this, that we actually put forward recommendations. So would you agree that protection of heritage should be one of the key points in the review of the Act?
I think, yes, we would strongly endorse that on behalf of all councils.
Now, you and Mr. Peachy both referred to a concept called demolition by neglect. What do you mean by that, and what can you give an example of something that you could refer to as an example of, quote, demolition by neglect?
Well, thank you for the question. It is, of course, really important to highlight that it's important to protect heritage, but also it's important to maintain and resource that protection. What we don't want to see is our items that have been recorded in some form of heritage protection not being cared for, not being maintained. And we understand that this is a costly process. Many of these items, as I noted, sit with local governments who own them or have a responsibility for caring for them. And this can be an extremely expensive activity. It also, I think, is important to understand, as I said in my opening remarks, that there's no common standard for the kind of preservation that should be seen. So in our submission, we've advocated for a heritage activation strategy. This would help councils, the New South Wales Government and the community identify suitable locations and opportunities for heritage activation. For example, to support incorporation of heritage tourism as part of the New South Wales Visitor Economy Strategy, identify engagement methods with local communities and councils, and we hope also would drive some funding for the activation and promotion of these heritage assets to show that they have much more significant interest, perhaps outside those who just live next door to the heritage item, for example. So there's a range of different mechanisms that can be explored for activating our heritage in New South Wales and funding its preservation. I know Mr. Peachy spoke about the city's scheme that also supports this funding. We do need a consistent standard and a mechanism to ensure that our heritage preservation is funded into the future. And we again urge the committee to make those kind of recommendations to ensure that we don't see our heritage falling in standard and disappearing for the future.
Ms. Scott, one thing that occurred to me is that as the spokesperson for local government New South Wales, putting forward a single position on heritage must be actually complex for you, because I listened to the opening statement from the gentleman from Lane Cove Council, and he talked about local residents not wanting to be adversely affected by tourism occurring from heritage, whereas in the same breath, in your statement just now, you referred to a desire for, and I know that Broken Hill in their submission wants cultural and heritage tourism. So how do you navigate that?
It's a great question. The way we navigate it is by working with the conference policy that is set for us by our council. So, of course, each year our councils come together, they submit motions that have been determined by elected councils, and then our conference delegates vote on them. Most often they're unanimous, but as you can imagine, not always. But that is the way that we democratically select the views that are the foundation of our policy on the basis of the voting councils. And so these kinds of recommendations that are often filled with detail based on consultation with officers and elected members of councils are the way that we form our policy. And of course, all our submissions are endorsed by our board, which is again a democratically elected group of councillors from across the state. I think it is important to recognise, of course, that it's important not to, expose people to extraordinary amounts of activation. And we of course, have seen examples where this has become problematic. But as a general rule, we know, for example, that so much heritage in this state is not known about. People don't know where it is. It's not activated in a way that people know how to access it and learn about it. Indeed, we've seen some controversy recently with a new development from the New South Wales Department of Education on Observatory Hill in Millers Point in the city of Sydney, an extraordinarily important site, an extraordinary site of significance for Australian history. And yet a recent modification to that development application to add a further story really threatens the heritage of that area. I would bet that so few people in New South Wales, even though this site is so significant, have been interested or engaged in the development that is occurring at this site. This is an example of the need to activate our heritage so that Australians, people in New South Wales, understand it, can learn more about it and can benefit from it.
Mr. Chair, do you mind if I ask one more question and then I'll you mentioned in your submission, and also your colleague, Mr. Peachy, referred to state-based incentives. What were you referring to? I guess tax-based incentives and state-based incentives. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. As I said, councils are concerned, I guess, about two elements. Firstly, that existing heritage protections are often turned off through the processes that are available to the state in the Planning Act, for example, when something is deemed state significant. But also we're very concerned, and this is via a resolution of our local government conference, to ensure that the kinds of incentives for preservation are present. I think, again, Mr. Peachy has highlighted a significant example in a beautiful shop in the Chinatown area of the city of Sydney that was uncovered as part of a development requiring an interim heritage order, and ensuring that owners understand the need and are supported to protect this kind of heritage, because the benefit is, of course, not just for the owner, but it's for the wider community to protect and support this preservation. So having a reasonable system that encourages owners to protect heritage where it's found to be present And in some cases, it's found to be present. For example, in this case, I think it was found to be present post-purchasing the item. It's really important to have a structured system of taxation from the state that rewards that kind of preservation for the wider public benefit.
Thank you, Ms.
Thanks,
Scott.
Councillor Scott. The Honourable Mark Buttigieg, and just checking in, Mark, you've raised your hand as well, so just making sure everything's okay.
Yes, everything's fine. Thanks, Chair. I understand we've only got limited time, so just a quick one, perhaps collectively to you all. Feel free to jump in. There seems to be, what jumps out to me from this evidence is that there seems to be an incongruence between the volume of items that local government's responsible for. You said 40,000, and I did a quick calculation on the funding. If it's 20,000 per council, there's 128 councils, so it equates to about $64 per item. In the case of Sydney, it's about $50 per item because you've got 400 items and $20,000. So and on top of all that, there is no mandated representation on the Heritage Council from local government. So is it a case that local government's sort of been, well, for want of a better word, ostracised with heritage, and it's largely left to what's perceived as subject matter expertise, and local council can just deal with it? I mean, and are these the sort of things we need to realign if we're going to take heritage seriously?
Thank you for the question. We would like a realignment, and that's why we welcome this review of the Act. Again, it is extremely important to see more local government representation on, for example, the important decision-making bodies. That was one of our recommendations, and we would also support the City of Sydney's recommendation to have the state architect represented. We think it's very important to have those views and voices around the table. We've also asked for a better way to, for example, deal with Heritage New South Wales, both for local governments acting as a proponent or as a consent authority. The example that is often cited is the Bathurst Railway Museum. Staff from the Bathurst Regional Council took 2 years to attain a consent from Heritage New South Wales for what they describe as both a slow and vague request for information from Heritage New South Wales. It was only resolved by council officers travelling to Sydney to meet with Heritage New South Wales in person. Obviously, this was pre-pandemic. The main guidelines for heritage approval were published in 2001. They require significant updating to ensure that advice provided to councils is contemporary, is relevant, and is achieving an outcome, again, that is in the public interest. So, yes, we think stronger local government representation is very important on the key decision-making bodies and particularly the Heritage Council. And we also think that it's important that the work of Heritage New South Wales be updated to ensure that it's relevant and achieving a public good.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. I'll now go to our crossbench members. Do they have a question? And Reverend Nile, please.
Yes, a question for Councillor Linda Scott. The National Film and Sound Archives was recently in the news over the need to digitise many of its works before they perish. Would state and local heritage items kept in libraries, museums, galleries, etc., be in a similar situation at risk?
Thank you for the question, Reverend Nile. It certainly is the case, and we acknowledge the importance of not only physical heritage, but also cultural heritage and the importance of protecting that. So yes, I think it is certainly the case that local governments would support the preservation of relevant digital heritage to ensure that the cultural elements of those heritage classification items are considered.
Thank you. Most of, if not all, libraries hold a lot of local history items in the way of photographs, maps, publications that are in need of preservation. would they also require some sort of digital initiative?
Well, thank you again, Reverend Nile, for the question. Of course, it is really important, and councils are doing a lot of that work. I certainly know, again, in my own council, the City of Sydney, we have an extraordinary set of archives with photos and plans and all kinds of really remarkable local historical items. Again, I stress, Reverend Nile, it's why we've sought to ensure that there is a full system of recognition about what the standard is for preservation, so councils understand that, and also provide some funding mechanism for local governments to then meet these standards in a consistent way. I stress councils are very much doing that work of our own accord right now in our archives, in our libraries, but you are right to highlight that without consistent standards, proper protections and funding, that kind of preservation is at risk.
Just another quick question. Once these items are digitised, would it be costly for them to be upgraded into a database such as Trove, Trove, for all to access?
Reverend Nile, I think the answer is yes, it would be costly, but the importance of protecting these items is of course significant.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Mr. Shoebridge.
Thanks all. Sorry I was late. I had a conflict this morning in my diary, but I've got out of it as quickly as I can. Can I ask you each about the just the general direction of the government's reform paper? The three key policy themes, and I'm using the government's own terms there, three key policy themes are making heritage easy, putting heritage to work, making heritage relevant. Now, the National Trust and many other submissions have criticised the absence of other, probably more important key themes, which is protecting and conserving heritage. Do any of you have any views on that? And I might ask you to kick us off, Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. Yes, as I said in my opening statement, it's critically important to ensure that preserving heritage is the defining characteristic of this review. It's significant because this must be the most fundamental goal, and that must be front and centre in any of the reforms that are recommended to follow this review. Again, as I said, to manage the over 40,000 locally listed items across the state, councils receive between $5,000 and $20,000 per council. And so one of the biggest risks to the preservation of heritage in New South Wales is the risk of demolition by neglect. There must be a mechanism for ensuring there is a set of minimum standards that are funded, and that the review not only recommends that an additional primary driver here must be preservation of heritage, but also a mechanism to support that and support local governments having a key place in that.
Mr. Beattie?
Yes, I think there's the points that the city's raised in terms of protecting and conserving heritage, that as Councillor Scott mentioned, the powers that are needed to manage situations where there is demolition by neglect and buildings are not properly maintained, that would certainly go towards better protecting and conserving buildings. And I guess also the conservation can be, conserving heritage buildings can be, improved with ensuring the expertise is on the Heritage Council, and having targeted incentives that go towards the conservation outcomes, particularly adaptive reuse, rather than just trying to recognise the effects of listing, which can be overcome with good conservation and adaptive reuse. And I suppose the other part to it is the current switching off of the Heritage Act for state significant development is a threat to protecting and conserving important places.
I will come back to that, Mr. Peachy, probably through the lens of the Fort Street School. But could Mr. Trodria or Ms. Newell, do you have a view about the absence in the key themes of conserving and protecting heritage?
If I may speak, Mr.
Yes.
Shoebridge, Lisa Newell here from Hornsby Council. I think preserving and conserving heritage is a fundamental principle of any legislation to do with heritage. The three themes for the review, I didn't see those as fundamental principles for either a legislative review or for proceeding with looking at ways of improving necessarily the legislation. They did seem to us to be more operational ideas and certainly objectives, operational objectives of perhaps a strategic business plan that might be introduced. But yes, preserving and conserving heritage is absolutely critical to any Heritage Act. It's actually part of most environmental legislation around Australia as a fundamental principle. Making heritage easy, putting heritage to work and making heritage relevant. There's nothing wrong with any of those, but they do seem to be operational principles. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Terry Tredray,
Do any
Lane
of you,
Cove.
Mr. Trodria?
Sorry, Terry Tredray, Lane Cove. Yes, we agree that with Ms. Scott that protection is a necessary legislative requirement, because it's true that listing is a disincentive to ownership, that maintenance and adaptive reuse become expensive items, and the disassociation of interests. Therefore, I think financial intervention measures are a critical element of this paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much. One of the case studies, if you like, of the way state significant development overrides all the heritage protections is the Fort Street Public School at Millers Point. The National Trust have made strident objections to the most recent proposed change there, which is going to add an extra story to a modern infill element, which is then going to be higher than the observatory building. And they point out that the historic heritage observatory building needs to be the highest building there for it to be fulfill its historic function of observing the weather. Yet that was given almost no weight, well, no statutory weight in the development application because of the way the heritage laws are turned off by the Planning Act when it's state significant. Councillor Scott, did you have anything further to add on that? And then I might particularly ask you, Mr. Peachy, from the City of Sydney's perspective, as it's in your patch.
Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. Look, it's just an extremely disappointing application by the state, because you would hope that they would recognise that the importance of that site and the importance of the preservation of that site is something that they should not breach via an application for an additional floor, especially in light of the fact that the original application was one that really there was broad support for, but the modification really has meant that there have been an overwhelming number, indeed hundreds of strong objections from, of course, heritage bodies, as you outlined, but also community members living in the area. And so it's just extremely disappointing that this application has gone so far. It's a perfect example to highlight that it should not be the case that heritage protections can be turned off so readily under the planning laws of this state. It should not be the case that simply because of the mechanism of development approval that an application proceeds along in New South Wales, it has different heritage considerations. If something is considered significant in order to be protected, that power shouldn't be turned off because of a special pathway that it's deemed to be under the Planning Act. So this is a case example to highlight that on a very, very significant bit of public land.
Mr. Peachy?
The city's, has certainly argued for you know, switching back on the Heritage Act, I think this is a case in point where providing that independent review that the Heritage Council can bring under that legislation can raise the heritage issues. I don't myself have close association with this application, so I might take on notice, if that's all right, to review the city's submission to the modification, and I can report back to the committee a statement.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And if you could address the fact that we have one government agency assessing another government agency's position and the complete absence of the Heritage Council in that. Could I ask each of the councils?
Mr. Shoebridge, I'll now need to ask government members to raise their questions. Is there a government member?
Mallard here.
Mr. Mallard, thank you.
You're welcome. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming in and giving evidence. And morning, Miss Councillor Scott. Good to see you again. Am I coming through there?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was saying there's nothing on my screen. Look, I want to ask Councillor Scott, being that you represent all local government across the state, not just the wealthiest council in New South Wales, which has, you know, having been there for 12 years myself, a lot of money to give out heritage grants and to preserve its own heritage properties. Let's look at other councils. What would you propose? And it's easier to say the state should hand out money. Let's just put that aside, right? What would you propose as a sustainable funding model for councils to support local heritage across the state?
Thanks, Mr. Mallard. Look, I just, of course, as you'd expect, refute your concept about the City of Sydney's financial state. I'll note in the midst of the
it's in trouble now, is it?
We lost a significant amount of money, but I'll put that to one side in the interest of
there's a scoop. Tell us more.
Answering your question. I certainly do, and again have highlight examples both from Baptist about the need to have a better structured system of engagement with Heritage New South Wales with respect to their approval for their museum, but also the concerns about turning off heritage protections through the state's significant pathway. This is
I'm talking about funding.
Yes, so there's some recent examples of that in Willow Grove in Parramatta, the Albion and Royal Oaks hotels in Parramatta, and the demolition of heritage homes in the Haberfield Heritage Conservation Area, which is, of course, in the Inner West Council. More broadly on the funding mechanism, it is a really important point. And as I said in my opening statement, councils certainly do advocate for the need to ensure that this is better funded. And you are right to highlight that councils, for example, particularly those councils in regional areas, have an extremely low rate base, and they're provided with very little funding. And so it is significantly challenging for them to ensure that these things are protected. And I guess I highlight an example, for example, the Brewarrina fish traps, a really remarkable, globally significant site of significant Aboriginal cultural heritage. When one goes out and visit those fish traps, as I'm sure many of you here have, one can see that the local government is doing absolutely everything it can to preserve that site, indeed to run a museum, as I highlighted, to encourage tourism and other activations so that more Australians can learn about our First Nations history. And as we said, that is one way. The activation of heritage through sustainable tourism is one way to ensure that there can be a secure funding mechanism. Of course, we advocate that the state government steps up their funding, but there are other mechanisms for doing this as well. And so, Mr. Mallard, that's why we have advocated in our submission for a heritage activation strategy that would help councils, the New South Wales Government and the community identify suitable locations and opportunities for the activation of heritage, and then incorporate this heritage tourism in a sustainable way as part of the New South Wales Visitor Economy Strategy. We think that is one sustainable way to ensure that there is activation of these sites and therefore some additional funding available for their preservation.
Well, thank you for that, Councillor Scott. My next question is to Mr. Peachy from the City of Sydney. As you know, I was on the council and on the Central Sydney Planning Committee. I'm quite aware of how the heritage floor space scheme works, and we're looking at that quite in depth in this inquiry. Could you just assume that we 101 just have no knowledge of really how it operates, and could you just step us through how the heritage floor space actually operates at a practical level?
Yep. The heritage floor space scheme is a market where there are sellers of heritage floor space and also buyers of heritage floor space. And the principles behind it is that the ability to sell heritage floor space helps fund the conservation of heritage items in central Sydney. So the scheme applies in the central Sydney area, which is the CBD. It doesn't apply widely throughout the whole council area. So an owner of a heritage item, a locally listed heritage item, if they undertake heritage works, they can then make an application to the council to be awarded an amount of heritage floor space. Now, that floor space is a portion of the amount of total development potential that could otherwise be realised, but can't because it's a heritage item. So they're awarded this amount of floor space. It goes on to a register. And the other side of the market,
which is held by the council,
which is held by the council. Yep.
Okay.
On the other side of the market, you have the sellers. So the council's planning controls say if you're building a building in the city centre and you wish to achieve the maximum floor space, then you need to purchase an amount of heritage floor space. And that amount will depend on the size of your building.
Is that exceeding the controls, or is that within the controls?
It's within the controls, and the controls are structured such there's a base amount of floor space
And a bonus.
But to access a bonus, one of the conditions of accessing that bonus is that you purchase heritage floor space.
Got it.
So there's now an obligation on the developer of a building to purchase the heritage floor space before the development can proceed. They then consult the register and make contact with various owners and come to an arrangement or an agreement to purchase the floor space for an amount that is agreeable to each party. The council is not involved in pricing the heritage floor space.
How is that price arrived
at? By agreement between the sellers and the purchasers. So there's a number of sellers that they can approach, and whoever is prepared to sell and buy at a certain price, that's the arrangement they come to.
Clearly, it's a commodity that's desirable by the developer. Okay,
that's right.
Thank you for that. I hope that helped my colleagues. It reminded me how it worked. Thank you for that. That's the end of my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Martin has a question.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll start with a question specifically for Councillor Scott. In the Local Government New South Wales submission, it's noted that the approval processes for state heritage can be somewhat onerous and complicated. Would you be able to expand a bit more on those issues?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Martin. I think the most relevant example, as I've cited, is the Baptist Railway Museum example, where officers spoke to us about the fact that it took them 2 years of engagement and indeed required a need to travel to Sydney from Bathurst really to secure a final agreement. This shouldn't need to be the case. Indeed, it's obviously unsafe to do so, particularly at the moment in a pandemic. So really, we would just urge, as we have in our submission, for there to be an ability to ensure that there is a minimum standard of maintenance repair, clearer guidelines from Heritage New South Wales, an updating of their standards, as I noted, considering they were last amended nearly 2 decades ago. These are the kinds of reforms that local governments would welcome to ensure that it's possible to have a more straightforward engagement with clearer advice coming from Heritage New South Wales.
Okay, and I'll follow up by opening up for all witnesses here at the moment. How might we be better able to integrate a reviewed Heritage Act in with the planning processes that we currently have under the EP&A Act to actually deliver these conservation outcomes?
Any witness would like to respond first to Mr. Martin's question, please?
If I may, Lisa Newell from Hornsby Council. The first thing that I think that probably needs to happen is for both Heritage New South Wales and Planning New South Wales to come together and not be so siloed. They have been siloed for quite some time. It's a common thing with agencies. It's actually divided those two agencies for the last 15 years. And bring them together. They know that they work together very well when they try to, and open a review that is about both. It needs a fair bit of housekeeping and homework ahead to actually structure it, get it together, get both agencies working together to work out the terms of reference and the mechanics of a review. One happened in the early 1990s, a big review of the Heritage Act and the EP&A Act, and it happened step by step together and very, very openly. And both of those reviews are very fruitful because every time an issue came up in one, it was answered and able to be dealt with by the other. And it worked quite well, and it actually ended up in a very different act by about 1993, which we're largely dealing with now. So the premise is that they actually do work together and just open that review and set up a review across agencies. And it would also need to take into account the National Parks and Wildlife Act and Local Government Act as well, and to open it to very big community input to look at the scope and issues. I think it's very important to open that up very broadly. Thank you.
Mr. Martin, I might just add, it's very important, for example, that the enforcement powers are aligned. I'm sure you would know that the Minister for Planning is undertaking a really significant reform of the Planning Act right now, and they seem at this point to be at cross purposes. For example, we know that the state government via the Building Commissioner is improving the ability of the state to collect levies for compliance activities, but at the same time reducing the ability of councils to undertake and collect levies for compliance. And this is going to have a cost to the ability of councils to do compliance for heritage protection. This seems counterintuitive. Similarly, the bill before the Parliament about the ability of the state to, via regulation, change the mechanism for developer contributions is extremely problematic because we understand that while the government is yet to put that regulation on public exhibition, but they will do so, that threat of a significant income stream for councils similarly is at cross purposes to the protection of heritage and councils having an ability to fund and be able to afford to activate that. So I really appreciate you highlighting the intersection between these two acts and the need for them to have corresponding reform that works together, that doesn't set opposing goals.
Thank you all. I think I've taken us well over time now. Thanks for your time here today.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, Peter, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. On that note, I'll take this opportunity to thank Councillor Linda Scott, Mr. Ben Peachy, Mr. Terry Trodria, and Miss Lisa Newell for attending this hearing and for your participation. Mr. Peachy, the Secretariat will be in contact with you in relation to the question you have taken on notice. In the interim, to help accommodate the changeover of witnesses, we'll be taking a short break until 10:45 a.m. A friendly reminder to committee members to now place yourselves on mute and also to turn off your video until we reconvene at 10:45 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the chair speaking, Peter Poulos. Could I just ask the our witness have just joined us to conduct a quick sound, starting off with Ms. Vines, can you hear me?
Oh, beg pardon. There's a terrible echo. Everything you say twice.
I can hear you. Mr. Saviak?
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Very well.
Thank you.
And a quick sound check. Ms. Kate Wool.
Hello, yeah, I can hear you, but I'm getting a lot of feedback on the sound. Yeah.
Chair, I think that someone may have the telecast on at the same time, so I think that's providing the delayed echo, is my suspicion.
Yep. Okay.
It sounds better now.
Is that much better?
Yeah, it sounds better now.
I'll test now too. Yes, no echo for me. Terrific. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Well, good morning and welcome to the review of the Heritage Act 1977. The committee is resuming proceedings. I now welcome our next witnesses, Ms. Elizabeth Vines, Ms. Kate Wool, and Mr. Jeff Sowiak. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation, starting off with Ms. Vines, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Elizabeth Agnes Vines. My position is Heritage Advisor for City of Broken Hill, and I'm speaking on their behalf. And my affirmation is I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vines. And Ms. Will, could you also state your full name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
My name is Katrina Wool, Kate Wool. My position is Business Manager of Strategic Planning at Golden Council. And my affirmation is I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Sowiak.
Yes, my name is Jeffrey Vasil Soviak. I'm the General Manager of the Shire of Bawarrina, and I swear that the evidence now given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
and
much. And
would you all like to commence by making a short statement, starting off with Ms. Vines?
Thank you. Well, our submission outlines that critical to the success of the Heritage Program, which was initiated in Broken Hill back in 1987, has been a strong partnering with the New South Wales Government over the years. And this partnering has been, a key to this partnering has been the continuous financial assistance provided by the state government. And so therefore, in response to the key points for Broken Hill from the terms of reference, point 2, which talks about consideration of new supports to incentivise heritage ownership, conservation, adaptive reuse and activation, is a key one for an outback city like Broken Hill. Here, heritage tourism is a key economic driver. Property prices aren't like they are in the city, so that if you invest in a heritage building, you do not get that investment back in terms of increased property values. And so this issue about support from state government is critical to the success of our program. And we've been delighted to partner with the New South Wales government in this. And indeed, we've been able to show multiplier of effects of about $1 allocated to government to Broken Hill by state government has been multiplied about 11 times in the local community, with spin-offs of job creation and so forth. The next key point in terms of reference for Broken Hill is around streamlining of heritage processes. Now, this is a key issue. We do experience long wait times for approvals from Heritage New South Wales, which can be off-putting to property owners. Previously, we were one of, I believe, 2 councils within the state that had delegation, and this was a good response to our remote location and also a recognition that council takes heritage management very seriously. And so that we were able to, in a sense, to process our own approvals process related to buildings on the State Heritage Register. So we consider, even despite the recent dispensations and new exemptions that have been introduced, that this delegation would be good for us as an outback city, being quite different from a city context. The Heritage Advisory Service in Broken Hill has been a leader in the country, and really we believe that we spend the resources allocated to us in a very responsible manner. We also have an annual heritage strategy which helps us benchmark the process that we're undertaking and makes the council accountable. So those are really the key issues that we respond to. Our recommendations are the need for local skills training, boost support for heritage advisory services and boost financial support. And once again, I express council's gratitude for the partnering that we've had for more than 30 years with the state government, and we would love that to continue.
Thank you, Ms Vines. Ms Wool, would you like to make a brief statement, please?
Yes, thank you. Look, I think what we would, Goulburn Warwick would echo a lot of what Broken Hill has just submitted in terms of the issues raised there. But in addition to that, I think that we probably would want to highlight more than anything the issues that we're experiencing here with our heritage. We have a number of very large heritage sites that are becoming derelict and subject to vandalism, and some are state heritage listed, some are locally heritage listed. The issues we're having are that, you know, similar to what Elizabeth just mentioned for Broken Hill, that the property values aren't particularly high, and some of these sites are extensive. So, for example, one of them, the Kenmore former mental hospital, which is of a scale like Gladesville Mental Hospital, Allen Park in the city. And it's very difficult for private owners to work their way through the complexities of meeting the requirements to satisfy heritage legislation or planning legislation, and also actually make a development feasible when they're of a large scale. So I suppose increasingly what we're seeing is more loss of an increased pace with the loss of sites due to neglect and vandalism, and that's one concern. The other concern is for council as a landowner as well of heritage sites. We have quite a few heritage properties in council ownership and management, and working through the heritage process as a landowner is actually quite an eye-opener, because you see the difficulties with that. It's also an issue for us in our CBD. We have a number of historic office buildings which tend to be only occupied at ground floor level and not adaptively reused, because they the tenants prefer brand new purpose-built buildings on the periphery of town because they're easier to meet, you know, sort of building code requirements, premises code requirements, and they're cheaper. So it's interesting. We've got a really diverse, extensive amount of heritage, but it's just saddening that the system as it is, whilst promoting heritage, doesn't actually provide a lot of feasibility for the ongoing use of some of these properties.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wool. And Mr. Sowiak, would you like to make a brief statement?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. We've obviously made a very short submission, which the Commission has on hand. There's four key issues that I think I'd like to stress from that. The first is obviously Aboriginal heritage. Our shire comprises the largest population of Aboriginal people of any shire in New South Wales, over 62%. And we certainly employ more than 80% of our actual staff are engaged in as Aboriginal people. So that's fairly high, and 33% of our councillors and senior meet that category as well. The issue in terms of Aboriginal heritage is that there's been three sort of different pieces of legislation dealing with this: the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, the Heritage Act, and the National Parks and Wildlife Act. I guess the National Parks and Wildlife Act is because of the concept that Aboriginals were fauna, and perhaps that was the reason why it came under that legislation. But there's two significant pieces of ways in which to look at Aboriginal heritage. The first is the relics, the archaeological value of the physical substance that you see, the fish traps, the actual construction, the trees, the burial grounds and so forth, and the anthropological interest, the significance of the area. So the story, the language, the spiritual connection to Biamisningu, that's more than just a waterway and some fish traps. That's a story about the history of that and preserving that story for the future. In terms of the submission, we've stressed that we need one piece of legislation that covers Aboriginal heritage and artefacts, and we need that needs to happen at some stage in the future. And there's more than enough examples from other states of different pieces of legislation, and I think that's what we do. But one of the important aspects is community engagement. We talk about community engagement. At the moment, 4 or 5 people can get together, register an incorporated association, call themselves a community representative group for Aboriginal people, and go out and seek government funding and promote themselves. The New South Wales State Government has a fairly rigorous structure in terms of the local land councils, and we recognise that structure. The governance structure is there, the accountability is there. They've got to report to someone, they've got to do annual reports, they've got to do financials, they've got to keep track of what happens with them. And I think the state government should use that avenue more in terms of community engagement and getting that recognition rather than necessarily the loudest voice of the minority who claim to speak on behalf of community and don't. The other issues in terms of the submission and in terms of dealing with heritage issues is the layers of development. You go through different steps, and you've got the Heritage Council, you've got the Development Control under the P&A Act, you've got the cultural clearance, you've got the fisheries in a case of waterways, you've then got Crown Lands who come in under that somewhere, and then the National Parks and Wildlife Service. All of that is very complex. In terms of categorisation, reading through the submission, we just had concerns that this may be overcomplicating. Let's keep it simple. If it doesn't need to be fixed, why fix it? So keep it simple. So we've asked for that. In terms of enforcement, I think we should move from enforcement to agreement. There seems to be a lot of pressure that if someone doesn't do the right thing, you enforce something. Well, no, you educate. You reach agreement with people. We had a history here where we had a Walmaringle station, a shearing station. On the Colgall River. It's a significant building. It's significant in terms of what they had there in the history of that site. It was under the control of the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, so a government agency, and we heard that a contractor had been called to do some demolition work out there because there was asbestos sheeting, which is an issue. That's neither here nor there. So we approached and we did issue an interim heritage order. That was just to get their attention that this contractor was about to do something, perhaps, and then we sat down and talked with the owners of the property, which is a government agency, And rather than spend $10,000-$20,000 on experts to give us opinions and to go through the process of legislating the heritage order or whatever, we just reached agreement with them and said, look, you understand this is a culturally and heritage site. We need you to manage it as such. They said, yes, that's what we do. And that's all we needed, that sort of agreement. We don't need a very complex process to make that happen. And I think we need to emphasise that more in terms of heritage, reaching agreement with people, and perhaps the fees and structure should be conscious of the fact that if we're going to have to go and pay for qualified people to do things, then maybe the fee structure should be reduced to pay for that. You know, we've only got $1 million rate base here, so we don't have a great deal of money to spend on consultants and heritage people to do expert advice on property that we don't own. So let's not make it too complicated. I think that's about all I needed to summarise from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soviak. I'll now ask members of the opposition if they have. Mr. Secord.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the benefit of Hansard, Walt Secord speaking. Mr. Soviak, you talked about in your submission, there's in your verbal submission, you talk about interim heritage orders and that. Do you at the moment have a register of heritage sites in your shire?
We do have a register of sites. We have a heritage study which was undertaken by a part-time heritage consultant who we engaged on 1 or 2 days a month or whatever, 1 day a month I think it is, and worked with our local heritage to do a register of sorts, and that's in our LEP. But the list needs to be updated. It's out of date, and obviously there needs to be some investment in that, which we don't have the capacity to do.
Now, the reason I ask this question. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm getting in repeat echo. Okay. So the reason I ask this question is that are there sites in jeopardy or at risk in your shire due to neglect, but not willful neglect, but just financial neglect?
No, yes, you know, I can talk to a number of public buildings. The Catholic Church in Gaduga is past the point of repair, and it's a historical timber. It probably, well, it would have historical and heritage significance, but it's just been left to a state that's unmanageable in terms of restoration. So yes, that would be true.
Now, back to the Brewarrina fish traps. Does council have any jurisdiction or responsibility over those?
That's a very tricky issue as to who actually has responsibility, and certainly the fisheries would argue they have some responsibility. The Heritage Council would argue they have some responsibility. It is a nationally listed heritage item, so it's both on the state register and on the federal register. So the Department of Planning, Environment, or whatever they're called today, is responsible. So yes, under control, but the reality is it's owned by the local traditional owners. You know, fisheries can't tell the local traditional owners how they can manage that which they own. And perhaps in government agencies we forget that there is that connection to country, there is that connection to the land. And at the end of the day, you know, we've done a lot to destroy that very same structure over the last 50 or 60 years or more, and now it's time to actually recognise and preserve it.
One last question to you. Does Brewarrina have cultural tourism? Do you in fact get economic benefit from the fish traps?
That's an interesting question, because there is certainly some some tourists who come to our community specifically to see the fish traps and to go on the tour, which I'd recommend to anyone who comes to Bawarrina. It's a very good tour, and they go through. But the story isn't about the rocks in the river. The story is about the cultural connection to those rocks. What was the trading operations? What was in place before European settlement came? That's the story, the spiritual significance of the site. We want to promote this not as a tourist attraction, but we want to promote it because it is the most significant cultural asset that we have in this country, and it's located 200 or 300 metres behind me.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to Mrs. Vines.
Could I just step in, Mr. Secord? Has someone inadvertently got another app on or live streaming in the background? If we could just disengage it and make it easier so we can avoid the echoing. Mr. Secord, could you repeat your question for the benefit of Hansard, please?
Yes, it's for Ms. Vines. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, the echo has stopped. Now, the situation in Broken Hill is that the council has quite a good record on heritage and preserving the outback city, so to speak. How could the Heritage Act and the government assist financially in helping with preserving the buildings of Broken Hill? Do you have a plan or a strategy or an approach that you think that would be? Because Broken Hill is very unique.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for acknowledging the significance of our city and how we are trying to be as responsible as possible.
Yeah.
In a sense, our submission underrepresented the biggest strategic challenge that we have in relation to the mining challenge. We are, as you would know, inscribed on the National Heritage List, which was a big achievement we felt back in 2015. The then Minister Greg Hunt was very much personally involved in that inscription, and we're very grateful for that. However, I think we are struggling to build for the council and ourselves a bigger strategic framework about how we can manage responsibly all those huge numbers of assets, hundreds of them on the line of load. And there are real issues around that management because, as you would know, as people would know, that generally mining companies are beholden to, at the end of mine life, rehabilitate the land.
Yep.
Now, the tension is that we actually want to retain those assets, those physical assets, but they have no use. Big concentrator mills, large structures, which are representative of the story of mining in Broken Hill and indeed of international significance. The froth flotation development happened at Broken Hill and so forth. So I think again, I keep getting back to resourcing and assistance from the state government, which is so useful to us. But we would even want more, in a sense, leadership from our state government, and we recognise the very limited resources of the federal government, but in helping with that challenge, because their mining goes up and down, and at some point there's going to be end of mine life issues to deal with, and there are structural issues to deal with. And so I think it's quite a complex problem, and I think what we've been managing to do day to day is kind of rescue challenges as they come up or save issues as they come up. There has been in the last, I would say, 5 years, a considerable financial investment by the private sector in some buildings in Broken Hill. I think of the Broken Hill pub, a $6 million investment by a local person into creating a pretty hip pub in Broken Hill. As a tourist, and believe me, there've been many up until the last few weeks, you know, when we're in now a new crisis time, but everybody's been going to Broken Hill. I've been personally encouraging people to go to Broken Hill because we can't travel overseas, and they're amazed. They're amazed at what they find, and also delighted in the standard now of accommodation, standard of meals, and the standard of tourism. So I think on that front, both the council, the help from the state government, and the investment by private individuals, which is thankfully happening, is very important. So, but it's the bigger strategic level that we need ongoing help to deal with the mine closure issue, or mine management issue.
Ms. Vine, a bit of a left field question here.
Yeah.
But I know that you have very unusual historic buildings in Broken Hill. I know I visited the Broken Hill Synagogue, and I've also visited the Broken Hill Mosque. Now, I understand that the mosque is actually in quite a state of disrepair. So what do you do when you have national significant buildings like the Broken Hill Mosque, which is part of our national history? What does the council do, and how does the state government assist when you have situations like that?
Well, the mosque, look, the two buildings that you talk about, the synagogue and the mosque, are, you know, quite small scale, fragile buildings, and it's a case of getting the right sort of technical advice to make sure that they're maintained. The mosque did receive some grants money over a few years ago. I wasn't involved with the council at the time. I think some of the key sort of maintenance issues sadly weren't addressed with the money available. And essentially what you have to do with these fragile places is keep them maintained, have a watching committee keeping them maintained with expertise and finances from the council. So at the moment, what we have now, specifically around the mosque, is a new schedule of works that I prepared, but we don't have the money yet. And it's a bit unfortunate because we got some money, but some of those, and they're not huge issues, maintenance issues. It's a bit like our Brewarrina friend. We don't have a huge race base. We've got more than Brewarrina, but finding even, you know, 50,000 or so forth out of a council budget for maintenance issues is difficult. So I think it's this keeping watch, keeping people involved and connected. I mean, there is a particular character associated with the mosque. I don't want to name names, but he's, you know, a Muslim cameleer, you know, descendant.
I've met him. I've actually met him.
He's a wonderful guy, and it's so important these people feel they are heard and involved in the process. And so particularly as somebody on the ground, and I'm sure Kate would feel this too, that making sure people, and certainly the man from Brewarrina, I'm sorry, I don't have your name up on the screen. It's all about listening to the community, keeping them engaged, feeling like they have a connection, whether it's Indigenous connection to country or whether it's a Afghan descendants connection to his place, or the Jewish community to these unusual places, or the whole of Broken Hill connection to the fact that they had tin houses and they're important. Listening to the community and engaging them is so important. You can have, you know, a city slicking expert come in and write a snazzy conservation plan and schedule of works, and it's misguided. It's about how that is delivered as well, and training local tradesmen and all of that connection to the place, which is so important. And quite frankly, needs resourcing. If we think Broken Hill is of national significance, we need some national help.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Vines. I actually, the person from Goulburn, I would like to ask one quick question about the challenges in Goulburn. So Goulburn, now we referred to the Broken Hill Mosque and Synagogue. I know that last month the Heritage Minister listed the Jewish cemetery in Goulburn. Has there been any support beyond simply listing it? And does council have any plans in that area?
Kate Wool from Goulburn Council. Look, no, at this point in time, that was very much a community-led activity. There are a number of members of the Jewish community who initiated that with council support for that listing to occur. I think over time, council actually has been sort of supporting the maintenance of the site at one point by doing the maintenance on the site. But at this point, no, it's just been listed, and presumably there'll be applications made for grants under the state scheme now that it is.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Is there another opposition question? Mr. Primrose, please.
Yes, thank you. Just in the very short time that I have, can I ask all three witnesses, and you may wish to take this on notice given the time, in their submission, the Local Government New South Wales made a number of recommendations, and one was recommendation number 8, and I'll just read it out. The New South Wales Government should explore legislative changes to the Local Government Act that would enable local councils to offer a rebate or concession on council rates for land with local or state heritage listed properties on an opt-in basis. Can I ask any of the witnesses if they have a comment on that, please?
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr.
Just in relation
Vines raised a hand.
Okay. Just in relation to that, well, obviously the rates is not a significant issue. You know, most of the properties would probably have a minimum rate, you know, $100, $200. It's not going to be a significant issue in terms of a rebate in relation to heritage properties, and also most of the heritage properties are in public or benevolent hands, so there's no issue in terms of them being rateable to start with. So yes, it would apply for more larger centres though.
And very briefly, Ms. Vines.
Yes. In relation to council, the issue is that they struggle with the rate base that they currently have. And in a sense, let's take the Broken Hill pub example, which has had this fantastic investment. In a sense, to encourage an incentive for a development like that would be great, but the council doesn't want to miss out on its rate base because it struggles as it is. And I suppose the question is about the public good of heritage. It's not just Broken Hill that benefits by it being a significant place, it's the country. And so that's why I keep talking about the importance of the close partnership with the state government. This is an important place for the state, and therefore external assistance is really, really gratefully received in recognition of its significance.
Thank you, Ms. Vines. It's the Chair speaking, and I'll ask members of the crossbench if they have a question.
Yes, I do.
Reverend Nile, please.
Reverend Nile. For Ms. Kate Wool. One of the points in your submission states there could be a greater role for the Department of Public Works in employing additional tradespeople with heritage experience and offering apprenticeships for heritage trades. Would it be a benefit if some of these apprenticeships are earmarked for First Nations Aboriginal people, in particular if they are working on Aboriginal heritage conservation sites?
Yes, I think that would be quite appropriate to extend it to First Nations people as well. I think definitely one of the issues that we're having at the moment with our local heritage grant scheme and even with our CBD grant scheme that we run is that there's shortage of suitably qualified tradespeople to work on traditional sites, whether they be European or of Aboriginal cultural significance. So definitely leaving it to the commercial sector isn't working now. So if Public Works could extend its coverage and provide a service to areas like ours or Brewarrina or Broken Hill, I'm sure that would be quite valuable and well subscribed.
Just following up that question for Jeff Sawak. The submission by the Brewarrina.
Oh, the same question? Yeah, look. Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, the submission.
We already employ eight or nine, I think, Aboriginal trainee workers on our workforce through various funding bodies. So that's something we're currently doing anyway. And most of my employees and the majority of my employees are traditional owners as well. So when they're involved in Aboriginal heritage and restoration, it's not really an issue in terms, and even our roadworks, it's not really an issue in terms of getting someone on board who's culturally aware and sensitive to those issues.
And just following up that question, this is Reverend Fred Nile. The submission by the Baroraina Shire Council notes there is evidence of occupations before and after colonisation remains in the Baroraina Shire.
Sorry, there certainly is evidence of that, yes.
Have these sites been listed in heritage?
Yes, they have. We've got the oldest example of construction, of human construction in the world at the Bawarrina fish traps. We've got the mission out at Bawarrina Mission, another site out there that's where all the people were brought from all over the Western District to this area to live, and certainly those stories are important and they are something that is preserved.
I assume you had discussions with the Baroraina Council.
Sorry, I didn't catch that question.
Council.
Yes, the Bawarrina Council.
Yes, they have.
Yes, we're certainly involved in that, and we certainly work with the Land Council. We actually have a project to try and remove the weeds that are growing in amongst the rocks at the moment, the fish traps at the moment, and that's been an ongoing program that we're funding from our own funds.
Good. Thank you. That's my question.
Thank you, Reverend Nile. Before I go to Mr. Shoebridge, could we be mindful of the echoing as creeping back into this broadcast? Mr. Shoebridge.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Mr. Soriak, I might start with you. The Bawarrina fish traps are this extraordinary testament to the cultural ingenuity, the talents, and the history of First Nations peoples, Numba peoples and others. How much funding do you get on an annual basis from the state government to preserve and protect that state-listed heritage item?
Zero. The only funding we use is the funding the council provides. We're spending probably around $20,000 to $30,000 a year on average to try and actually just maintain the weed growth, which is the problem at the moment.
And whilst that might be a spectacular, I think some other people need to mute.
So I didn't catch that. Sorry.
Whilst that might be a very spectacular,
it's Mr. Soriak, maybe if you switch your video off, Mr. Shoebridge could ask you a question and then you can respond.
Okay.
Mr. Shoebridge.
All right, I'll start again. Whilst that might be a very spectacular site, the Bawarrina fish traps, there are multiple state heritage sites in each of the other two council areas. And I assume it's the same in each of your council areas. You get no funding at all to protect state heritage sites in your areas.
Okay, well, speaking, yeah, that's correct. We only get a very small amount of money for the Heritage Advisory Service, which is about $6,000 a year, and we get about $6,000 a year to run our small local grant scheme. But in terms of their state heritage items, no, we don't get any.
If I could add to that, same issue in Broken Hill, although Broken Hill does add to the $6,000.
Yes.
I also work in Wilcannia as the Heritage Advisor. Central Darling didn't put in a separate submission, but the issues that I'm talking about in the Broken Hill submission are exacerbated and even more in Wilcannia. However, I could say that in Wilcannia, I mean, my role in Wilcannia focuses on settlement built heritage. I make that very clear. And my expertise isn't in Indigenous heritage, although of course it's all embracing and inclusive. But my role is to assist in helping to maintain those buildings which were built on the Darling River when Wilcannia was the biggest port in the state, second biggest port in the state. The drip feeding, even of small amounts of money in that community, has saved buildings. Supplemented by an excellent program run by the New South Wales government called Heritage Near Me. When I say it was excellent because it gave us more resources. It wasn't so much excellent the way it was administered, it just helped with resources. So
even very modest amounts of additional funding, provided they come consistently year in, year out, can be very significant for heritage protection. Do you all agree on that?
That's right. And the programs that we've got in Wilcannia and in Broken Hill are often to help people buy the paint to paint their own houses. These are people whose houses are literally worth only sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, and they've got no income beyond a pension, which is minimal. So to be able to give them $1,000 and trust them to go and buy some paint, you have to give them the money before they do the work, because they can't do the work, and build up a sense of community ownership and trust. And you know, if in a couple of cases the money is misspent, you turn a blind eye, because if you get all administrative and bureaucratic and punish people, it's ridiculous when we're talking about small amounts of money. It's encouragement money. And I did love what Jeff Sowiak said about encouragement and, you know, partnering as opposed to compliance. So yes, whatever support you give locally, if it is even given out in small cases, it's important in small circumstances. Important.
And Ms. Vines, you're the first person who's really made that very clear, cogent case that in many cases, particularly in rural and regional New South Wales, these aren't wealthy property owners sitting on some fancy heritage mansion. They are people struggling to get by, and even modest assistance is critical.
And look, I would give you 3 examples in Wilcannia of important early buildings where the property owners have probably received grants of up to $100,000, and you think, gosh, that's a lot of money. Their property is not worth $100,000 more, but what is being contributed to that community incrementally, you always have to have a long-term perspective, not short-term, means that those buildings aren't ruinous and vandalised anymore.
I invite you to give us that information on notice if that's not too much trouble. I think that would be very useful.
Okay.
Could I ask each of you to quickly, there's only about 3 minutes or so left in this round. The government's review paper proposes 3 key policy themes, and that's the words of the paper. They are making heritage easy, putting heritage to work, and making heritage relevant. A good number of submissions, including the National Trust, have pointed out that some of the most critical points, being conserving and protecting heritage, are not found in the government's key themes. And indeed, they should be the underpinning of a heritage review. I might go in reverse order. What do you 3 witnesses think of that proposition?
You know, look, I do apologise. I was just writing down what you wanted me to do, and I missed the last bit. I'm so sorry.
Well, do you have a view that the government's 3 key themes in their review that guide their review are making heritage easy, putting heritage to work, and making heritage relevant? A good many submissions, including the National Trust, have said it's missing the most critical points, which is conserving and protecting heritage. And that should be the guiding goal for a review. Do you have any observations about that?
Can I start? Yeah, I do. I think what I've kept saying is we need resources to actually do stuff on the ground that saves sites. There's been this fashionable twist with heritage about telling stories. Of course, they're important, but if a building's gone that you're telling the story about, there's not much point in telling the story. So I agree with what you're saying. The missing conserving and protecting. Conserving involves resources, protecting involves leadership. And those two key things, I think, you know, let's make it easy, let's make it, put it to work, let's make it relevant. They're all sort of buzzwords about almost like telling the story. The fundamental is we've got to get out there and resource to do the stuff, to save it.
Ms. Wool? Ms. Wool?
Hello, yes, I would agree with what Elizabeth just said. I suppose what I would add is I think in my comments on the objects, I think I also added conservation and management as something that the objects of the Act should include. I think it's not just about conservation as such, but it's the understanding of actually how, if you own one of these properties, what does it entail? What skills do you have to manage it? Some of these sites are extremely complex, and there's just people, they might see that land is quite cheap, they buy it, and then they really don't know what to do with it. They don't have the skills to approach banks or get appropriate finances to see that the property is actually going to be used in a meaningful way. They don't know what to do next. So it's not just about conservation management plans, but it's also about the skills that people need to actually appropriately manage and use properties. And I think a lot more education around that is required in order to get the conservation outcome that people or the community would like.
Mr. Soriak, did you have anything?
Yes, the issue is making heritage easy is important. I think that's probably a very, very strong ambition. Putting heritage to work, I would probably focus more on the community enjoyment of heritage and not necessarily the economic or opportunities that arise from that. Just having something that's culturally and spiritually significant and preserving it for the sake of its significance. And in terms of relevance, yes, we need to recognise our beautiful places, and we need to be able to do that in a way that's easy and recognises that community benefit. So yeah, conservation comes under that.
Thank you, Mr. Soriak. And Mr. Shoebridge, I'll now ask government members if they have a question, and starting off with Mr. Franklin.
Thank you very much. And can I start with Ms. Vines? And I guess something a little rare for me is to basically echo some of the words of Mr. Shoebridge and to say that I think that your evidence today has been exceptionally compelling, particularly your advocacy for the incredible impact small amounts of funding can do for regional and remote communities, but obviously more broadly than that. I wanted to start by picking up something that is both in your submission and that you also referred to in your opening statement, which is the multiplier effect of funding conservation and heritage projects. I think you talked about it being 11 times the dollar value, which is extraordinary. Can you basically expand on this a little bit and talk about the benefit of this multiplier effect to both the preservation of heritage within your community and the benefits to the broader community in itself?
Sure. Well, how we measured that, and we haven't done it recently because sadly of change of staff in Broken Hill. There was a very good Director of Environmental Services who had a spreadsheet related to how much money we go to a small grants program, what the project spent, and therefore, because in many cases, I would say, the little bit of money made the project possible. If it's, for example, painting a house or rebuilding a front veranda, small scale projects. So let's say that you give a property owner $500, which is what we started with, which sounds like peanuts in a city context. But as I said, it allows you to buy your materials. Then you multiply that, then you look at what does that generate? And okay, the $500 then gets added to, invariably it gets added to, either in labour, which you are able to factor in at a labour rate because people are actually doing the work, even if they're not being paid. So we in Broken Hill in the beginning of our scheme allowed dollar for dollar funding to be matched by contributions of labour. So what we found in the first few years is that you have $500 and that might generate let's say $2,000 worth of improvement to a house, because by the time they painted it and tarted it up and did it, they'd added that amount of money. But then what we found was that once we gave a bit more money and there was more confidence in the community, the $1,500 generated $10,000 worth of work, because they think, wow, we've got $1,500, and then they might borrow a bit from the bank, and then they might get a family to chip in, and suddenly you have $10,000 worth of work. So what's that? That's only that's 7 times, right? 1,500 to 10,000. But also what we were doing was we get 500, let's say we get $1,000 from the government, $1,000 from the council, and then we actually get dollar for dollar. So someone's given, let's say, $2,000 from those contributions, and they put in $2,000, whether it's cash or in labour. What we were then finding, and we sadly no longer measure it because this council staff member isn't there anymore, but we were getting up to $11,000. And so, for example, the Broken Hill pub would obviously skew the figures. You know, we might have given them $3,000 for their veranda replacement, and that, you know, there's a $6 million project. Well, that would completely skew our figures, right? We wouldn't do that. That would be kind of lying. And look, along the way, we did a little bit of fudging to help. But the reality is that if you go to politicians and you say, give us $1 worth of state money, we will multiply it 11 times, and that equals jobs. We're always being told we need to create jobs. And look, that's how we kept getting money.
That's great. And what you've done in Broken Hill has been extraordinary. It's now, I think, one of the most important arts and cultural centres in all of regional, in fact, all of New South Wales, in fact, probably all of Australia, as well as obviously having done an extraordinary job with heritage. Can I move on to looking at how we can potentially replicate that across regional New South Wales and look at the benefits that you've been able to achieve and discuss? And I'd like to pose this question to all 3 of the witnesses, but starting with you, please, Ms. Vines, the sort of incentives that you think would help to deliver these benefits. Now, I know that you've talked about the importance of increased training and support. For example, the Brewarrina submission has talked about potentially including not requiring application fees for heritage DAs and so forth. But I was wondering if the 3 of you could please expand on what you think the most effective incentives would be in order to continue with preserving and protecting our heritage in regional New South Wales.
Well, look, one initiative which South Australia has is that the construction into the CITB training board, when you do a development application, you put in a levy, which is about training tradesmen around the state. I don't think it exists in New South Wales, but essentially we've got a very good program here where in South Australia, because I'm based in South Australia, I'm based in Adelaide, not based in New South Wales, where if the CITB levy has been used to do skills training in heritage. And there have been a number of projects around the state where buildings in community ownership, particularly, for example, that have rising dam problem and stone issues, then there is a stone company here in South Australia that does this training to train stone tradies to do the work. So the levy is being used. I don't think that applies in South Wales, and I think it's an excellent initiative that we've had here. Through the Heritage Near Me program, the parameters of the program were very broad, and I thought that was great. Look, I keep talking about resources. I'm sorry, but I do. Financial resources. It's all because financial resources are then used to build, can be used if they're effectively managed to build skills. We in Broken Hill, through Heritage Near Me, Broken Hill has a population of 19,000 and there's quite a few builders there who know nothing about heritage. And we organised through the Heritage Near Me a similar kind of thing that the construction CITB board does in South Australia. In fact, we got the same company up to do some training on stone conservation on walls of the local stonework in Broken Hill. So it's about skills training, it's about resourcing, it's about training people. And look, I commend the New South Wales government with their Heritage Advisory Service that is still the best remaining one in the country. Other states have dropped it off, but it's the most effective way of spending money in the country. And and there was a year 2000 assessment of the advisory services programs around Australia and how effective they were in terms of managing heritage. And the resources provided through those networks in each of the states, but particularly in New South Wales, was argued as the most effective way of managing heritage because of its multi-pronged approach to not just giving money, but providing expertise on the ground. By then sharing these in quarterly meetings, which of course now could be held on Zoom, but used to be held in Sydney. It's this capacity building. We have e-newsers of heritage networks and so forth. So it is a combination, if you're asking the question, more money, more skills, more training, more connections, more listening to local people and people like me. You know, I'm at the end of my career now. I'm doing this now. You know, I'm trying to retire, but I love what I do. But we need people in their 20s and 30s doing this sort of stuff and to hand on the mentoring that people like Kate and I do and all the advisors in New South Wales do. We're a passionate bunch of people.
Thank you.
And I really commend the government in keeping that service going and resource that more because you'll get more than $6,000 per council.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vines. That's very helpful.
Quadruple it.
Could we move on to Ms. Wool and just ask about the same question about the incentives that you think would assist, would most assist in this space?
Yeah, look, I think from our perspective, the issues surrounding some of these big sites and bigger commercial sites in town and you know, things like old former mental hospitals, orphanage sites, these bigger properties is often that it's almost sort of a rabbit in the headlights syndrome with some owners and with some consultants even in terms of navigating how to deal with issues like the Building Code of Australia, accessibility, fire, in some of these sites without sort of diminishing the significance of them. And I think whilst we have a heritage advisor, it's a fantastic service, but even then, I think with some of these bigger sites or some of these more difficult technical sites, there just needs to be a greater availability of like a sort of a mediating body to help negotiate these issues. I think what we're facing again and again is that, you know, greenfield sites where you get to build your own building are just too attractive an alternative, and as a result, we're just are going to struggle as time goes on with managing these properties and making them relevant and worthwhile, and which is tragic because the community is very, very passionate about heritage. In every piece of consultation we ever do, heritage is one of the first and foremost things that, you know, comes up. So it's just a matter of trying to make the process more accessible so that it doesn't sort of create that initial fear or repulsion to the idea of going into one of these sites and actually doing something meaningful with it so that we keep it.
I noted that your submission also suggests introducing heritage enterprise grants. I was wondering perhaps if you could unpack that just a little bit.
Yeah, look, that came, that was actually noted in the discussion paper. But I think, yeah, I think it was South Australia has a scheme and maybe Victoria has one as well where the state provides like an initial payment, and effectively that allows for the redevelopment or adaptive reuse of a building, which then gets sold off, and the profits from that then get rolled into another project where that can then fund sort of an ongoing rollout of improvements over different sites. And I think something like that would be fantastic, especially for some of the really big sites, because they're just sitting there doing nothing. And truly, the owners, I think, half the time don't know what to do with them. And the easiest path is just to let them effectively or wait for council to issue a demolition order on them. They get that bad, or for a fire and burn them down. So I think, again, it comes back to that sort of providing different stimuli to sort of get these properties sort of back in action again, and look at an enterprise fund, starting off with a seed investment in one property and rolling it on. That would be great.
That's great, Ms. Wool. And finally, Mr. Sawiak, did you want to add anything to those comments?
Look, I just want to reinforce the words that Elizabeth spoke about in terms of increasing the funding for the Heritage Advisory Service. That hasn't seen any increase in donkey's years. It'd be nice if that was increased and topped up a little bit, because we never get enough hours for that. And the other difficulties within small rural shires is getting experts to help us with modifications to our LEP to update our heritage inventory. Those are issues that we just don't have the capacity to deal with.
All of those contributions are incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. I don't know if either of my colleagues have any questions in the remaining very small amount of time. Sorry about that, colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Any questions from government members?
Been covered it comprehensively. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. On that note, I'll take this opportunity to thank Ms. Elizabeth Vines, Ms. Kate Wool, and Mr. Jeff Sowiak for your attendance and your participation, your valuable participation today. A question on notice has been taken. Ms. Vines, the committee has resolved that answers to questions taken on notice be returned within 21 days. The Secretariat will contact you in relation to the question you have taken on notice. We will now be taking a short break until 12 p.m. to help with the changeover of witnesses. A reminder to members to please go on mute and to switch off your videos until that time, and we will resume at 12 p.m. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Saying, I'm not sure why, if you turn it to mute and turn off the vision.
That's
For 15 minutes.
Hello, it's the Chair speaking, Peter Poulos. To the two witnesses who've just joined us, could I conduct a very quick sound check, please, starting off with Mr. McInerney?
Yes, hello, Peter. Is that all right?
Perfect, thank you. And Mr. Lindsay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
We're just waiting for another witness to join us, and we'll start shortly. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the review of the Heritage Act 1977. The committee is resuming proceedings. I now welcome our next witnesses, Mr. John McInerney, Dr. Michael Barclay, and Mr. Adam Lindsay. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation, starting with Mr. McInerney?
Yes, my name is John Michael McInerney, and I'm a committee member of the Millers Point Community Resident Action Group, and I'm happy to take an affirmation.
Please do so.
Now, I've somehow, but my screens are occupied, I think, at the moment with the.
Would you like?
I can do it. Sorry, I've got
Okay.
it now. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. McInerney. Dr. Barclay, could you please state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation? If Dr. Barclay, could you please take yourself off mute, please?
Had a mistake.
Not
My
at all.
name is Michael Barclay. I am president of Friends Fernhill Local Valley, and I will take the oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you, Dr. Barclay. And Mr. Lindsay, I'll invite you now to proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Adam Lindsay. I'm the Executive Director of Sydney Living Museums and New South Wales State Archives, and I'll take an affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Lindsay. Would the witnesses like to start by providing the committee with a short statement? Mr. McInerney, did you wish to provide a short statement?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Poulos. I guess in introduction, I should say that Millers Point is probably the heart of the heritage of New South Wales, if not Australia, as most people will know. I've lived here for over 10 years and have been a member of the local committee for all of that time. And I'm fairly closely aware of the difficulties that we have had and the benefits of the Heritage Act. I suppose in summary, a broad summary, I would say that the problem we've identified isn't so much with the Act, it's the administration of the Act. It's a bit like local councils where you can't blame the Local Government Act, but you can certainly blame the Mayor and the CEO who don't manage it properly. So I think my feeling, or the feeling of our group, is that it's the administration of the Act that's the problem, although we do accept that there are certain benefits and improvements that could be made. And we've enumerated those, some 18 points we've put at the rear of our submission. If I could just perhaps point to one of them we think is probably the most important, that all development applications for heritage items should be assessed at the relevant council level. Our difficulties particularly have been with involving the officers of the Heritage Council in local decisions. We find that either they don't come out to the site or they use some rote process to solve our problems. We've found increasingly the local council solves our problem, and we have lobbied in the past for more delegations to local council, to the extent now we're operating quite well in Millers Point, but there are still some minor areas of delegation that would be left. But I think delegation to local councils is the direction. But again, that's an administrative matter rather than necessarily an act problem. And thank you, Mr. Poulos.
Thank you, Mr. McInerney. Similarly, Dr. Barclay, would you like to also provide a short statement to the committee?
Yes, please. I'll just give a bit of background, and that Friends of Fern Hill and Mulgoa Valley is a community-based nonprofit organization. Our objects are to include to safeguard the cultural and natural heritage of Mulgoa Valley, and to encourage responsible cultural and ecological tourism while respecting the amenities of its residents. Friends of Fern Hill is a partner in the Alliance for Public Parklands, a coalition formed to protect significant parklands in the Greater Sydney region. Mulgoa Valley is principally significant as a cultural landscape that's evolved over the 19th century through large estates established by the Cox, Jameson, and Norton families. The evolution of the rural land uses and historic associations with the community are demonstrated in the collection of homesteads and village cottages, the local public school, St. Thomas's Church and Cemetery Reserve, and cultural plantings, and the Mulgoa Road, which has long served as the principal means of access. Mulgoa Valley is perhaps the richest area surviving in the Sydney Basin for its number and diversity of natural and cultural heritage sites, its diversity and scenic landscapes. Its cultural value resides in its visual character, the combination of large estates such as Fern Hill and village settlement, and the natural values of remnant open forest, cleared rural land, and the broader setting of the Cumberland plain woodland and treed hillsides. Last year, we nominated Mulgoa Valley for listing on the Heritage Register as a cultural landscape at the suggestion of the Greater Sydney Environmental Commissioner, and consistent with its Metropolis of Three Cities and Penrith City Council's Scenic and Landscape Study. Our submission to this inquiry is Mulgoa Valley centric and based on over 40 years of residences' experience with conservation and heritage issues in Mulgoa Valley, including issues directly impacting Fern Hill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Barclay. And Mr. Lindsay, would you also like to take this opportunity to provide the committee with a short statement?
Thank you, Chair. I don't have an opening statement to make, so I'm happy to get straight into questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lindsay. And I'll invite Mr. Primrose if he has any questions at the moment.
Just a couple, if I can. Just flowing out of Mr. McInerney's statement, you spoke about the importance of local government in resolving local issues. We had earlier a submission from Local Government New South Wales, and their recommendation number 4 to us was that local government's ongoing role in the management of Aboriginal cultural heritage must be clarified in any proposed reforms to state heritage legislation. It seems to me that we need to also broaden that to not only include Aboriginal cultural heritage, but in relation to cultural heritage itself. I was wondering if any of the 3 witnesses could just comment on what they see as what should be the role of local government in relation to not only Aboriginal cultural heritage, but also, in fact, cultural heritage more broadly? Maybe if I could begin, with Mr. McInerney, who raised that matter.
Thanks, Mr. Primrose. In our submission, we argued that there should be a separate legislative act to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage. We think it's necessary because the Heritage Act is firmly rooted in what might be called colonial history. Not to denigrate the Act itself, but I don't think it has either the background or the mechanisms in the Heritage Act, that is, to adequately deal with Aboriginal cultural heritage. On the other hand, I think it does have the capacity with some perhaps some strengthening to deal with what might be called white Australian cultural heritage. Again, I'm not denigrating white Australia, I'm just saying that's the reality of Australia. And I think the Heritage Act could deal with that, but I again make the point, Aboriginal cultural heritage is I think a step too far for the Heritage Act.
Can I ask Mr. McInerney, before I ask other witnesses to comment, could you also specifically address the issue of the role of local government?
Yes, sorry, you did ask that and I'd forgotten. I think in my experience, and I've actually served on the Sydney City Council, so I have a fair bit of local government experience from that side, but also from the local community. We have found and continue to find that the administration and advice and everything we need from a heritage point of view is best provided at the local council level, in our case. I must say, though, that the Sydney City Council probably has one of the best resourced heritage administrative sections in the state, and some have argued, in fact, it's better resourced than the Heritage Council. So I guess we're in a rather ideal position for me to say that. But on the other hand, I think the closeness of local councils to their, not only to the properties, but also the owners of those properties, I think is a strong argument to delegate most of those powers that the Heritage Council has back to local councils, perhaps having some review role from time to time. But I'm firmly convinced that the future role regarding heritage should be mainly carried by local government.
Thank you. Can I ask Mr. Barclay if he'd now address the issue?
Yes, thank you. Michael Barclay speaking. Our experience with council on Aboriginal issues has been limited to exposure to their policy, but beyond that, it's been very limited. We've had more success with obtaining information and liaising with the Darug community, and this is exemplified by our Colonial Connections event that we had in May, and the initial inquiry we had with council was regarding the archaeological research that had been done in Mulgoa Valley, and that proved to be very limited. And I think that's a wide open agenda for exploration. For example, on Fern Hill, the eastern or Littlefields Creek precinct has archaeological artifacts that have not been researched, and it's a wide open field. There are other places in the valley too that are of Aboriginal cultural significance. One took place on St. Thomas Church, and that has been documented. But in terms of what we've been able to obtain through our local government has been limited. In terms of the role of local government in cultural heritage, we've been working closely with council in our listing of or nomination for listing Mulgoa Valley on the State Heritage Register.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lindsay, I know that you addressed focus question number 2 in some detail in your submission. So my question for you was also going to be seeking to have you and ask you if you could elucidate on that, please. So can I just get you to possibly do both? That'd be great. Thank you.
Certainly. Adam Lindsay here. We did talk about alignment between state and national legislation in our submission. I think I acknowledge Mr. McInerney's point around the colonial nature of the Heritage Act. Indeed, it's a product of colonial Westminster government. I suppose I firmly believe in self-determination, and as a white man feel I've got limited amounts to offer other than aligning state and national and even local parameters around acknowledging First Nations culture. But what I would like to say is I think the mechanism, the act itself, is possibly less important than who administers that act and who makes decisions about that act, and that First Nations leaders and communities should be involved from and at all points in that process.
Okay. Do you have any views on the role of local government in relation to the matters we've been discussing? And I read out earlier the local government's ongoing role, both in the management of Aboriginal cultural heritage and cultural heritage more broadly. Do you have any views what the role of local government should be?
Look, in my profession, we deal with a lot of local governments. We have properties all over the state, deal with a lot of local governments. The requirements when you've got an item of significance, be it Aboriginal or not, the divergence of requirements between state and local and federal can sometimes add additional burden. So I would encourage that decision making be placed with the right entity, whether that's local, state or national, and that there be some convergence of the systems so that you're not dealing with multiple stakeholders to try and get things done.
Okay. Thank you. Since we're talking already, Mr. Lindsay, can I ask you to possibly elucidate on your answer to focus question 3, are the objectives of the Heritage Act still relevant? You make a number of suggestions. Could you please elucidate why you believe that they should be changed?
Certainly. We think that they are largely fit for purpose. As you can see from the submission, there's a couple of insertions in bold. We've suggested adding excellence in design and urban renewal. We're firmly of the belief that protection of heritage places is part of the story and part of the role of the Heritage Act, but that community expectations do expect activation and ongoing use, and that contemporary design and urban renewal should form part of the objectives of the Heritage Act. And we've suggested the introduction of a heritage fund, which is outlined in a number of other answers in our submission. But really that fund is there to protect and address the burdens and the costs associated with heritage listing and protections and potential heritage listings.
Okay. The recommendation number 10 of Local Government New South Wales, and I'm deliberately asking people to comment on specific recommendations here, was that the New South Wales government should develop a statewide heritage activation strategy to coordinate government efforts to activate and promote heritage assets, both built and cultural heritage, across New South Wales. This should commit a dedicated funding pool to local government to support the activation and promotion of built and cultural heritage across New South Wales. Now, Mr. Lindsay, I think you almost alluded to that in your response. Maybe if I could ask all 3 witnesses again, but begin this time with Mr. Lindsay.
Certainly, thank you. I think I'm in favour of anything that activates, celebrates and increases enjoyment of heritage places. Sydney Living Museums is a dedicated institution that does that for 12 of the state's most important historic and heritage places. Whether that I think it's very difficult to make a broad brush statement that funding is best provided to local government or even state government to activate those places. It's very difficult to say that one entity is best placed to coordinate a strategy for activating. So I really don't have any magic answers on how to get increased activation, because it happens largely in our organisation through a dedicated institution set up for the protection and activation of those properties. I think that a heritage fund should have, run by the Office of Heritage, should have a mechanism not just to protect heritage, but also to enliven, activate and celebrate heritage. So I won't make too many comments of whether that's best placed with local government or state government, but I do think increased focus and funding to activate significant heritage places is really important, particularly for two reasons: return on investment for those assets, but also to increase people's enjoyment, understanding and connection with those places.
Okay. Mr. Barclay, do you have a view on that?
Dr. Barclay, it's a chair speaking. Could you? Now we can hear you. Fantastic.
Hello, learner. Penrith City Council has done some activation through the Western Sydney Council and establishing a historic Western Sydney app, which can be used to explore Mulgore Valley, for example, as well as other historic sites in Western Sydney. That needs to be further developed and marketed. Other activations, I think they're allowing a minor reduction on council rates for heritage properties. That has been long-standing. But I'm sure that given the constraints that local government is under, that they would be, I would imagine they would be in favor of any increase in funding that would help them promote heritage and cultural tourism in the local government area.
Thank you, Dr. Barclay. Finally, Mr. McInerney, can I ask if you have any comments, please?
Yes, Mr. Primrose, the idea as you spelt it out earlier, I would fully support, and I know our group would as well. I think there is a very positive role for the state in the area that you talked about. In a sense, it's coming back a bit to the idea of delegating the details to local council and keeping the broader picture and broader direction at the state level. I'm very keen on that, and I think it could work quite well. And certainly from the point of view of funding the required resources, I think the state would have more ability to do that. So I'm fully in favour of it.
Thank you. That'll do me for the moment, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Primrose. Are there any other questions? Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I might start off. I think my first question is best directed to Mr. McInerney. Your submission notes challenges faced by residential property owners in the Millers Point area in relation to the heritage approvals process. What changes do you think could be made as a result of this review that would improve that process for locals?
Mr. Martin, I think the facilitating delegation would help. We started to lobby for more delegation to Sydney City Council some 8 years ago, I think, and it's taken all that time, and we still haven't got, or the council still hasn't got a full delegation. So in one way, it's an administrative process, but I think there are some little quirks in the legislation that could be ironed out and improved to allow this process of delegation to occur quite smoothly. I'm not 100% in favour of full delegation with no questions asked, because some of these matters are so important that it needs to be kept under review. So perhaps the Heritage Council's role could be one, A, of delegation, but B, some sort of monitoring position or review position that would rein in a council, let's say, that got out of control or really wasn't taking any notice of the heritage requirements. Is that an answer for you, Mr. Martin?
Yeah, thank you. Can I follow up? Do you believe that the current listing process and inventory processes provide enough clarity to owners on what fabric is and isn't significant, and what activities those owners are able to carry out without seeking approval?
The current listing process, I think, is good. And in fact, I think the review looked at even facilitating that more to allow a simpler process, which we would agree with. Associated with the listing, of course, are the heritage impact statements and the various associated documentation that goes with the listing. Some of those are quite detailed, perhaps overly detailed. And again, it comes back to the way in which the Act is administered. If the heritage statement is associated with the listing is too detailed, then it needs a fairly hands-on process to come up with solutions where there are problems in new construction. And that again is where the Heritage Council has not been able, or the officers of the Heritage Council, who in fact refuse to visit the sites, can't solve some of those problems. So again, it bolsters up the idea of administration at the local council level.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McInerney. I've got a question for Mr. Barclay and the Friends of Fernhill and Mulgoa Valley. The government's discussion paper has proposed introducing a special heritage listing category for landscapes. What are your views on some of the challenges with heritage listing larger landscapes?
I'm not aware of that which you mentioned, but some of the things we've encountered is, particularly in a large area like Mulgoa Valley, is community understanding of what it's all about and how it works in their favor, and that's affected by, I think, the demographics of the valley. In other words, more recent residents who have moved into the valley tend to have a different view than those who've been resident in the valley for one or more generations.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all from me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Mr. Franklin, you've raised your hand. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. My questions predominantly are going to be directed to Mr. Lindsay, if that's okay. So can I start by talking about the City of Sydney's Heritage floor space scheme, which was referred to in the first session of today. I understand that Sydney Living Museums, of which you're obviously the very well-respected CEO, has used revenue generated from that scheme to partially fund the upgrade of Hyde Park Barracks. So I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about that, the scheme itself, how the scheme benefited the project, and I guess improved conservation outcomes.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. We did use the City of Sydney's Heritage Floor Space scheme. It in fact provided the predominant funding source for the complete renewal of the Hyde Park Barracks. And if the committee members aren't aware, that's a UNESCO World Heritage listed site. So the conservation requirements and preservation requirements are at the very top tier. Along with funding from the Commonwealth Government and the state government, it allowed us to undertake a complete renewal of the site, both to protect it and also to activate it. Some of the outcomes were we increased the display space of the museum. We have more of the archaeological collection on display, about 40% more of that collection on display. We did a complete access plan for the site, and so the gravel pathways, which are part of the landscape now accessible to people who use wheelchairs. We put a passenger lift in, so people who aren't able to use the old stairways are now able to get up to the second and third floor for the first time ever. And we also did a companion website, and both the physical display and the Convict Sydney website have been recognised with a number of awards. So I think it's fair to say that it offered a very successful model for private-public partnership, enabling heritage protection and cultural activation. And for the organisation, it really gave an increased level of confidence.
Thank you. And can I publicly say, which I did say, I have to say, in the last inquiry at which you were a witness, but I do want to publicly say again, I think that it is an absolutely outstanding job. And I think that it is now an example, one of, really best examples that we have in Australia of how you've utilised that space and the stories that you've told and the balance between colonial history and Indigenous history as well. I think it's just superb. So do you see that scheme potentially being able to be utilised in either other SLM properties or other venues that you're aware of?
We have a number of other properties that are eligible for heritage floor space credits. We also have 1 or 2 properties that we'd like to try and argue into the scheme that aren't currently eligible. And look, we would love to, and I said this in my submission, I see other properties on the outskirts of Sydney, like Darlinghurst Jail, that would benefit greatly from heritage floor space. And I personally think having properties in Parramatta and then also the Western Sydney Records Centre, although not heritage, but in Penrith, that the growing cities there should be encouraged to look at such an offset scheme.
Do you think it would have any application potentially to be replicated in regional New South Wales?
Well, I note that some of the research says that it can't be sustained outside of a large metropolitan area. It's not a field of expertise, but I do think that if a local council can find a way to make it work, that they should. The benefits, we would not have been able to complete the renewal had we had not been the beneficiaries of such a scheme.
Thank you. Can I move on now to the Endangered Houses Fund, which the government's discussion paper refers to? And obviously you've had some interaction and involvement with. Can you give us basically a bit of a snapshot on how this operates and where this has led to good conservation outcomes for heritage properties, in your view?
Certainly can. It started formally in 2005. So the the Endangered Houses Fund was established formally in 2005. Its rationale is to identify significant properties at risk of demolition or unsympathetic development or similar, to take hold of those properties, and sometimes that's through purchase, sometimes that's through gift, and then we put our expertise and love and care into it and money, and then offer it back to the market for future generations. Now, in more plain terms, SLM addresses conservation deficits that have built up that the market, either buyers or owners, find unattractive or off-putting or out of reach for them to have the capacity or capability to repair. And so it comes in at a certain point and arrests that dilapidation, reverses that dilapidation or conservation deficit, so that it can be an attractive property to offer back to the market. It's produced conservation outcomes across a number of properties. Most recently, we're actually conducting some work on a Nissan hut at the moment, and that is the latest in our Endangered Houses Fund properties. And so that will be finished later on this year and then ultimately offered back to the market. And so that property is one of a number of surviving Nissan huts. It's significant because of its commentary on sort of the housing of that type, the small housing movement.
Excuse my ignorance. Is Nissan the architect or I don't know the term Nissan hut, that's all.
You don't know the term Nissan hut. So Nissan hut's a particular type of housing. I would share my screen and share a picture for you, but I don't know how to do that on WebEx. But it's a particular type of post-war housing. And basically there are a number of them in situ. It's significant because of the original nature of the fabric. It's also significant because of its place amongst a number of dwellings of its type. And so Sydney Living Museums purchased that and are now conserving that. Well, first of all, we got a DA approved and we're now developing according to that DA, and then we'll next year offer that back to the market. And so that property would have continued to dilapidate, would not have been an attractive residential property or investment property. And so SLM's intervention in that to arrest the conservation deficit and offer it back means it's there for future generations.
That's fantastic. The final question that I've got is, in fact, to all three witnesses, but it was prompted, and I'll start with you again, Mr. Lindsay. It was prompted, in fact, by something that you mentioned in your submission, which was something very, very basic and just logistical in terms of how the system could be improved. For example, the permit system, you say, could be improved with things like alerts for submissions requirements if the dates aren't met by Heritage New South Wales, which to me seems like an eminently sensible, very small thing that could be done, but could actually have a broader positive outcomes. I guess my question to all three witnesses is, do you have suggestions of smaller procedural logistical process type changes that can be made that we can recommend in our inquiry, but that would lead to really positive outcomes? But I'll start with Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. The alert system, as I've mentioned in the submission, I think is a sensible one, and I think that could play well with both applicants and also the Heritage Office itself, if you had a system that alerted milestones lapsing or coming up so that timelines aren't delayed. I think that the category system that the government has proposed in its discussion paper could also lead to simpler system-based processes, no-touch applications, for instance, that meet certain thresholds or compliance. And I think the new system, the new web-based system that Heritage have introduced, I think some exploration of what other capabilities that system has to allow more automation, more notification, and more information provision so that they can meet the kind of, I suppose, service expectations of the public.
That's excellent. Thank you. Mr. McInerney, do you have any comments to make about that question?
Yes, Mr. Franklin. I would argue for more staff to be available from the Heritage Office to quite early explain to applicants exactly what is required, what they can and can't do, and if necessary to go to the site itself and sit with them. Many of the problems related to heritage are really quite complex and specialized in a design sense, and the applicants, while having often the best will in the world, don't have the proper design advice available to them, often from their architects, by the way, to do what they would like to do. So I think early and expert advice available freely and as it were, not just over the counter, but also on site, to me would cut out a lot of the later confusion and unhappiness and dilemmas that occur.
Thanks, Mr. McInerney. That's very helpful as well. And Dr. Barclay, did you have anything to contribute on this issue?
Yes, I'd like to reinforce what John had mentioned. We've struck that here, but also I think it'll go a long way if prospective property purchasers and landowners were aware of the heritage conditions that affect their properties in the valley. We've had some discussions with Penrith Council officers on this matter, and I think it's a combination of getting the word out there locally and understanding what is required of them from the Heritage Act point of view.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And that's all of the questions from me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Franklin. And I think, Mr. Primrose, did you have a further question?
Yes, two, if I may. And I've been one very specific one that I forgot to ask Mr. Lindsay. It's the very last item, number D in your submission. Response specific to State Archives and Records Authority of New South Wales. You make a very specific recommendation. I was wondering if you could just elucidate on that, please.
Certainly. So the State Archives collection, the State Archives and Records Authority is set up explicitly to manage record keeping across New South Wales public offices. So it's not just government, it's also local councils, it's state-owned corporations, and it's also universities. And so the State Records Act governs the record keeping requirements of those public offices from creation right through to either compliant disposal or identification of archives of enduring value. And anything that's identified by the State Archives Board as being required as a state archive, having enduring value for infinite number of different purposes that it may have such inherent value, is required to be retained indefinitely and then ultimately transferred into the authority's custody and accessioned into the State Archives collection. Now, this collection is an unbroken record of a public record that predates, the material in it predates colonisation in 1788, and it's a significant collection, one of the world's leading collections documenting the wielding of colonial power, if you will, and has a dollar value over $1 billion. So its social, cultural, economic value is extremely high, and it acts therefore as a repository for academics, for researchers, but even more broadly for social historians and the public. Archives that are from the 1880s are being used now for a completely different purpose than they were originally thought to be used. For instance, early photographs of Coogee and the eastern suburbs communities that were taken as surveys for development are now being used to map coastal erosion. Very, very different purposes than we saw them created for. So this, as a body, as movable cultural heritage, may be thought of by some as being governed by or subject to the state heritage legislation. However, there's an exemption in place currently, and this recommendation would formalise that exemption to for the purposes of the legislation, clarify that there's no overlap and no jousting to be done between the record keeping legislation and the heritage legislation, but it would also then put in statute the independence and the determination of the New South Wales State Archives and Records Authority to manage its collection as its Act asks it to do.
Okay, thank you. Now, if I may just ask one general question, Mr. Chair. Now, Mr. Franklin asked for some very specific responses. I'm going to go to the other end and ask for a more general response, given the time we've got. And if I could ask all three witnesses, maybe beginning with Mr. McInerney, what do you think would be the most important recommendation this committee could make in relation to the Heritage Act? I mean, if you were able to be in the deliberative, make a recommendation, given what you put in your submission, what would be the most important thing that you would want us to recommend?
It's a difficult question, but
yep.
I guess from the simplistic side of the Millers Point community, we would just like to see the Act operate more efficiently, more effectively, and we still agree with the objectives of the Act, with the whole concept of the thing, but it's its operational procedures that seem to be lacking. And I'm not sure that you can, to be honest, that you can sort that out by amending the Act. I think the role of the committee may be to look at the way in which the Act is administered and to make recommendations perhaps in that area rather than changing the actual black letter law of the Act. Sorry if that doesn't.
No.
Not a good answer.
No, I think a number of us are certainly, taking a similar view. Can I ask Dr. Barclay if you have a view on that, please?
Yes, I think funding has certainly been a critical issue with the implement the Heritage Act. And also, I think that it's critical that the Heritage Council has a merit and skills and experience-based appointment of respective professionals and experts. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Mr. Lindsay, give you a magic wand. What would you do with it?
If I had a magic wand, look, I'll respond equally generally and big picture to your general and big picture question. I would say the most important recommendation from my point of view and with my experience is that we should have legislation that sees preservation of heritage and heritage values as the starting point, that it should promote access, enjoyment, celebration and promotion of these places' position in the heritage of the state. One of the things I think is most forward thinking about the Historic Houses Act is the word enjoyment. And I'm proud, we say this internally all the time, that the fact that one of our objectives as a trust is to promote the enjoyment of these spaces. Yes, we have to protect them and preserve them. Yes, we look at scholarly research and outcomes, and we look at public programs. But ultimately, most broadly, we celebrate their position in the heritage of the state, and we promote their enjoyment. And that gives us, I suppose, non-elitist license to be unashamed about hosting very scholarly exhibitions, doing publications, but at the same time having fantastic events and functions there, right through from weddings to more ceremonial celebrations of bicentenaries, etc. So it's that non-elitist attitude that allows us to sort of open up and say, you don't need a history degree or a heritage degree. Maybe the people making these decisions at first do. I'm not sort of commenting on that, but from an audience and attraction point of view, it really does open it up and says, actually, enjoyment, that's an accessible word. If we get away from all the nomenclature, all the kind of terms that we can get stuck in, the word enjoyment is completely universal. And so, in my opinion, I would love to see an act that makes that a priority.
Important point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Primrose. Are there any other questions? And to the witnesses, did anyone wish to make any final observations or comments?
Good luck.
Well, I'll take this opportunity then to thank our witnesses, Mr. John McInerney, Dr. Michael Barclay and Mr. Adam Lindsay. Thank you for attending this hearing and for participating. I also extend my appreciation to all committee members for their assistance and support during today's hearing. In addition, I'd like to extend my thanks to the Secretariat for their ongoing professionalism in helping to facilitate this virtual hearing. Our fifth and final hearing, it was scheduled for next Thursday, the 2nd of September. Until then, I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon, keep safe, and this concludes today's hearing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.